everyone, welcome back to another video. Today I am going to go through all of the books that I read in the month of May. I read the most books I've ever read in a month, 15 books. Kind of ridiculous. I think I'm on like a momentum roll because last month I read quite a lot of books and this month I also just couldn't stop reading. I found a new favorite, which I'll be talking about, and then I also read some books that were mediocre and just not really for me. I usually do these wrap-ups by going in order of what books I read, but this time to try something new, I actually divided it up into my ratings. I'm gonna start with my lowest rated books, my 1 and 2 star ratings, and then 3-star ratings, and then 4 and 5. I'm gonna start with my least favorite book of the month, and that was Severance by Ling Ma. Unfortunately, this is a very popular book here on BookTube. This is a book that I first heard about when I first started watching BookTube last year, right when COVID started. Everyone was talking about this book because this book also deals with a worldwide pandemic and a disease and a virus that takes over the world, rendering people fevered, which makes them sort of like zombie-like. This book follows the millennial 20-something-year-old living in New York. She's working in the corporate world. She's figuring out her life. She has like on-again, off-again relationships and is hooking up with this random guy. And then it sort of jumps between her life in New York and then also her living during the pandemic with this weird cult-like guy and his group of followers. This book was weird. It just wasn't for me. I didn't like where the story went. I didn't like the random tangents. I wish that there was a lot more story during the actual pandemic because that was way more interesting than the flashbacks to her normal life. The character was really unlovable. She just couldn't like figure her life out. She didn't know what she wanted. She was lost. It was just annoying to read. Like really not for me. Moving on to another 2-star read, Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. This is a book written by a Japanese author, and this book is also technically like a magical realism kind of book. It's set in the present in a coffee shop in Japan, but there is an element of time travel to it. And this book is separated into 4 different stories, primarily dealing with these characters that go to this coffee shop or work at this coffee shop. And there's a particular seat in this coffee shop that you could sit down in and travel back in time. And there are a lot of rules that involve the time travel, like you have to only sit in a particular chair. You can only go back to the past when you visited the coffee shop before, and your whole experience of going back in time has to happen before your coffee gets cold. It just didn't work for me. It was quirky, but I just don't think I like weird books. Again, didn't really care about the characters or where the story went. It's sort of like a slice of life. It was fine. It wasn't absolutely terrible, but it wasn't amazing. And overall, I didn't actually really like it. I just thought it was okay. And then the last 2-star pile was 50 Words for Rain by Asha Lemmie. This is a historical fiction, also set in Japan in the 1950s. This book follows a girl who is half black and half Japanese, and she gets abandoned by her mother on her grandparents' doorstep when she's 8 years old. Her grandparents are part of the imperial family in Japan, so they're like royalty. She's technically the princess's daughter, but because she's a bastard or not legitimate child, she's locked away up in the attic. Her grandmother gives her chemical bleaching baths because they want her to be whiter. They like beat her and lock her up, and she's having this miserable life. And then all of a sudden her half-brother comes into the picture and they develop this super intense bond and relationship, and she has this like love and devotion and dependency on him, and he's actually very kind to her. It was fine. It was gonna be a 3-star book for me up until the ending. I really did not like how it ended. I just feel like the character didn't really grow. There wasn't any depth to the characters. They were one-sided. So in that sense, this book just didn't work for me like I wanted it to. I have 6 books that I rated 3 stars. For me, 3-star is like the book was a little better than fine. I overall liked it, but it wasn't like super impactful or crazy amazing for me. I'll start with the 2 historical fictions that I gave 3 stars. The first one is Yellow Crocus by Laila Ibrahim. This book is set in the South. It starts in the late 1830s and goes into the 1840s. It follows a white child that is raised by her black nurse who's a slave. They develop this bond and relationship with one another. The white character in this book, her name is Lizzie. She has this coming of age story where she realizes what the Southern white people in her social social circle are doing and how they think and how they believe slaves are inferior. And so she has this realization in her life and rebels from her family and her upbringing. It was wholesome to read about, and I'm glad I read it, but it wasn't like an amazing historical fiction. My main issue was with the writing. It fell a little short for me. Some of the dialogue felt very childish and other parts felt very unrealistic that a 10-year-old would be talking like an adult. So there were just parts of it that weren't written the best for me. And another 3-star historical fiction was Snowflower and the Secret Fan by Lisa C. So this book is set in 19th century China, and it follows 2 girls and their coming of age stories and their intense friendship and bond that they created when they were little and the lives that they lived. It deals with a lot of the cultural elements that were put upon the Chinese people, particularly the Chinese women during this time period, like foot binding and arranged marriages and being seen as less than as a female and really completely worthless to a family. So there was a lot of things that I learned in this book that I really enjoyed reading about, and it opened up my mind to a lot of those Chinese cultural elements that I just wasn't really aware of. But overall, the story was not my favorite either. The relationship between these 2 characters frustrated me. It was very slow and repetitive, and it was sort of like a drag to read through for me. I had a very hard time reading it quickly. The text is also tiny and the chapters are long, so that was a part of it. Again, it was good overall, just not great, not my favorite. And then I have 4 nonfiction books that I gave 3 stars to. 2 of them are memoirs. The first one is Eat a Peach by David Chang. This is like a food and restaurant memoir. David Chang is a famous chef. He opened the restaurant Momofuku and a bunch of other Asian fusion restaurants. It is his childhood and how he got into being a chef and his experience opening the restaurant and being involved in the restaurant business. He talks a lot about his experience being bipolar and other mental health issues that he had. He deals with alcoholism and drug abuse. Reading this made me just kind of seem that this guy is sort of like a jerk. And he even acknowledges that. He's actually quite self-aware about his kind of attitude and arrogance and cockiness. I just didn't read this thinking like, wow, I have so much like respect for this man who did all these great things in his life. I mean, obviously you don't want to read a memoir about a person who has a perfect life and they're this perfect person, an amazing person, but I still want to end it being like, wow, what a great life story. But for me, this was just sort of like, that was okay. In a similar vein, the next memoir that I gave 3 stars is Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner. This is a new release. This book follows Michelle's relationship with her mother, who develops pancreatic cancer and dies from cancer, and she really dives into her relationship with her mom. Overall, it was kind of a strained, complicated relationship, but the parts that they really connected was around food. So this is somewhat of like a food memoir as well. I enjoyed reading it. I gave it 3 stars, but it wasn't super impactful for me because again, it just sort of felt like I was just reading this random person's thoughts on her relationship with her mom. She describes food in such an incredible detail that listening to this book made me so hungry. It was fine, but it wasn't like, wow, you're such an important historical figure that I need to know about, you know? But I should have known that going into it. All right, the next nonfiction is this collection of poetry by Rupi Kaur called Homebody. I read 2 of her other poetry collections in April, gave both of those 3 stars, and actually just reviewing my Goodreads, I realized this belongs in the 2-star category, not the 3-star category. Liked this one a lot less than the other ones, and overall, after reading all 3, I'm realizing her poetry collection is really not for me. I don't totally align with her philosophy and mentality. The poems that I enjoy was when she wrote about her relationship with her immigrant parents and being an immigrant in this country, and also her really heartbreaking poetry about rape and abuse. But overall, this is just not my kind of thing. And finally, the actual last book in the 3-star category is Show Your Work, 10 Ways to Share Your Creativity and Get Discovered by Austin Kleon. So this is a short little self-help book that has these 10 kind of main points that are like the manifesto for artists and creatives. I'm not necessarily an artist, but I am a content creator. I'm creating videos for YouTube. And so there were some takeaways that were interesting in here, but it still sort of just felt like surface level and it wasn't like super practical. And then there's some parts that I just didn't agree with, especially as I'm on this journey of like digital minimalism and not being attached to social media. I would say some of the advice in here was like, post every single day and make content all the time and share like everything you can, and I don't necessarily agree with that. But overall, I think this is a fun little book for artists and creatives to read. I don't see myself reading this again, so I'm gonna be putting this in a little free library soon. The first 4-star book book I'll be talking about is I'll Be There For You, The One About Friends by Kelsey Miller. I first heard about this book from Emma from Drinking by My Shelf. She was reading it and I immediately was like, need to read this book. If you haven't watched my favorite TV show video that I did with my husband, Friends is one of my favorite TV shows of all time. I've seen the show through so many times. It actually genuinely makes me laugh out loud, which is very rare because I don't find a lot of things funny. I love the show so much. This was all about the creation of the show, how the actors were cast, how it was written, and it went through all the separate seasons and even certain episodes. It dealt with sort of like what was happening around the world during the time, and it kind of critiqued certain things that the show did. Really enjoyed it, thought it was great. If you're a fan of the show, then I think you'd really enjoy this one. And then to tie it with the Friends reunion that just aired, I watched that a couple days ago. I cried like a baby. If you love the show, I highly recommend watching it. It's on HBO Max. I got so emotional about it. I don't know why, but it's just the cast coming back together and reminiscing and talking about their experiences in the show. Absolutely loved watching that one. The next 4-star read that I finished in May was In Order to Live, A North Korean Girl's Journey to Freedom by Yeonmi Park. This is a memoir that I've seen on YouTube quite a bit. A lot of people recommended it. It's very highly rated. I gave it 4 stars just because I found it a little bit boring and kind of tough to listen to in certain parts. Overall, I'm so glad that I read this. I really didn't know much about North Korea, except that people are not allowed to leave and it's a dictatorship and it's terrible conditions to live there. And this book touches on all of that, but in much greater detail of this actual girl's life and journey and her experience running away and defecting and leaving the country with her mom, and how when she thought she was getting help by people getting into China, she was actually bought into the human trafficking circle and she was sold many times and she was raped many times. And this book deals with a lot of heavy topics, a lot of content warnings, but it was still a really incredible story to listen to, so glad I read that one. And then the last nonfiction that I'll be talking about, I read quite a lot of nonfiction actually this month, Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer. This is a nonfiction deep dive into the slaughterhouse and factory farming world in America. This was one of the hardest books that I ever read or listened to. Physically made me uncomfortable and I had to stop. I would say this book is probably a similar experience to any like vegans who have ever watched those like factory farm slaughterhouse videos of pigs and cows and chickens being like tortured and cut up and all of the terrible things that happen. This book goes into all of those details and the history of factory farming and how it became a thing in our country, and also the practices that exist today and the kind of conspiracy around how this whole business works. And it truly is like this secretive thing that no one really knows about, and it's that way for a reason, so that we as consumers don't know about it and we don't want to hear about it and we just want to eat our meat and, you know, be happy with it. So in that sense, this was very hard to read, but it was an important read for me. I've kind of been thinking about, you know, being a vegetarian or a vegan and what that looks like, and have like on and off tried it, and I'm definitely open to it. And after reading this, I'm more open to it than ever, and this just, it raised a lot of like ethical and moral issues for me. This book is very emotional and intense, but if you are interested in learning about where your meat comes from, then I would highly recommend it. All right, next up, The Woman in the Window by AJ Finn. I finally read it. Mentioned this in so many videos that I was going to read it, and I did. I got to it. This is a psychological thriller with an unreliable narrator and an unreliable main character, and it's about this woman who has PTSD, and because of that has become agoraphobic, where she lives in this New York home and she cannot leave her house, and she has a lot of like mental health issues. She's also an alcoholic and is abusing her prescription pill doses. So she spies on all of her neighbors through the windows and knows kind of what they're up to or what they're going about. And there's some new neighbors that moved in across the street, and there is some domestic abuse happening, and then she witnesses a murder. And she calls the police, and it's sort of like The Boy Who Cried Wolf. She keeps calling 911 and things aren't actually the way they seem, so then they think that, hey, this lady is absolutely crazy and she's on drugs and she's drinking, so she's just hallucinating things. And overall, I had some issues with the book. Like, I'm not a big fan of like a person who is drinking and on drugs the whole time. It's just annoying to read about, and that was very prevalent throughout the whole book. And I remember a booktuber mentioning this before. You kind of know when a book is written by a man when there is absolutely unnecessary descriptions of women's body, when it doesn't add anything to the story. Like, there were a few of those parts that were like, why is that in here? why was that just described? But this was a very interesting psychological thriller. I did guess the ending and I guessed the other like twist that happens, but it was still like a fast, you don't want to stop reading. The chapters are super short, so I think with that, like, you just want to keep going and not stop. Overall, enjoyed it. I think this is like a 3.5, so I rounded it up to 4. It wasn't my favorite thriller. It's not a terrible thriller either, and besides those like unnecessary descriptions that aren't super explicit but just unnecessary, I actually found this to be quite a clean thriller, and I know a lot of those don't exist because I don't really want to read about very specific sexually explicit scenes and like gore and horror. So this one was actually quite mild and digestible for me in that sense, so did enjoy it. I did watch the movie on Netflix because it just came out, and it was terrible for me. I hated the movie. They changed a lot, they didn't add a lot of stuff, the acting was really not good for me, the cinematography and how it was filmed and edited was not good for me either. Really didn't like it. The book is much better than the movie in that sense. All right, the last 4-star book is Miracle Creek by Angie Kim. I have a whole reading vlog where I talk about this book. Really enjoyed it, was very engrossed in the story and cared about the characters. This book is a mystery thriller courtroom drama set in a very small town in Virginia. It follows this Korean family who has immigrated there, and they own this kind of alternative medicine building thing that like people who have neurological and kind of uncurable conditions come to receive care. So there are a couple kids who have autism, there's a man who is infertile, and another girl who has cerebral palsy, I believe. So they come to get alternative medicine and healing. An explosion happens in this facility and some people die, and then there is a trial. There's a woman accused of killing her autistic son. So it follows that story and things slowly unravel, and the truth actually becomes clear of what happened, who was involved, who started the fire, who had motive. I thought it was very interesting to read and very interesting how the events unfolded. The character development was also really well done for me, and you sort of found yourself rooting for a person one minute and then being like, whoa, no, they actually maybe are the ones who did it the next. So I kind of liked that back and forth and uncertainty of what's actually going on. Really enjoyed this one. And finally, I saved the best for last, my 1 5-star read for May and my new favorite book, Or the Lost Wander by Amy Harmon. I picked this up because I'm part of Angie from the Science Mama's historical fiction book club called Adventures in History, and this is a 2020 release. I believe it was in like the top 15 of the Goodreads Choice Awards, and I absolutely loved it. I could not stop reading this. I didn't want to put it down. I read it in a day. This book follows Naomi and her family who are leaving on the Oregon Trail, and then it follows John Lowry, who is a half Native American and half white man who is sort of seen as an outcast. He doesn't feel like he belongs with Native Americans or with white people, and so he sort of floats somewhere in between. He's very reserved and quiet, and he joins this next like caravan group of people who are leaving on the Oregon Trail to help them. And of course, Naomi and John Lowry fall in love, and there's this beautiful like wholesome romance throughout this whole story, and it was very sweet to read about a romance in a very clean way as well. I don't like when there's like a lot of explicitly sexual things in books, and this one didn't have that. It was very wholesome to read. It made me cry. This book is so sad. I mean, there's like a lot of very tragic things that happen in this book. But yeah, it was absolutely incredible and a new favorite. I had to buy it. I'll be recommending it to all my friends who also love historical fiction. That is my very long list of books that I read in the month of May. It was very enjoyable. I'm glad I branched out and read a lot of books by Asian authors for Asian American Heritage Month, and overall a positive reading month. I do want to read more 5-star books. I want to try to keep that momentum, and so I think for next month I'm really gonna just try to mood read and pick up books that sound super good to me and not really have like a forced TBR. I have a few planned reads, but besides that, I'm just gonna see what happens, you know? Thanks so much for tuning in and watching, subscribing. Appreciate all the love and sweet comments, and I will see you guys in another video soon.